right, so I'll go ahead and get started. It's about 5 after. So today we're going to talk about the art of self-compassion. So why do I call it the art of self-compassion? Well, I do believe that self-compassion is a skill set. I do believe it's something that we can learn to do and cultivate um, in our lives. It is a strength that over time, the more we practice it, the better we are. It becomes more instinctual to just respond to ourselves with compassion. And I think compassion is a key resource, obviously, when we're caregiving. I think the heart of all caregiving is compassion. But I think often it's very easy for caregivers to forget to give themselves some of that compassion as well. And self compassion is the motor of compassion that we express externally, right? If we are not feeling compassionate towards ourselves, it's very difficult to sustain compassion for other people. Okay, so we can experience what we call compassion fatigue, right? Where you're just tired of caring. And that happens because when we pour our care outward and we never invite any of it back into ourselves, we become depleted. Okay, so this is a very helpful skill set to learn, and it is what makes your caregiving sustainable and you're less likely to burn out. Of course, there's no fail safe cure all for burnout, but this is another tool in your toolbox that can help you to navigate your caregiving world with a little less overwhelm, right? Okay, so our agenda today, I'm going to discuss the 3 components of self compassion. And I think once you understand what makes up self-compassion, it's going to be easier for you to implement it more in your daily life. Then I'm going to go over the benefits of it. And then I'm going to share with you a few exercises that you can use. Or of course, there's a million of them online, but these are just a few that you can use to start to cultivate that self-compassion. And then I'm going to end with what we call a loving kindness or a meditation. And it has been very helpful for me on those days where I am feeling a little more apathetic, those days that I am feeling kind of tired of caring. The meditation is a great way to kind of reground and come back to why we do what we do, right? So I'm going to share that with you at the very end. But first, I want to share with you this quote by Jack Cornfield. And he says, "If your compassion does not include yourself, it is not complete." Okay. That's kind of uncomfortable to sit with, I think, sometimes, right? Because we think we're caregiving, we're giving people, we're empathetic people. It's always out, 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 right? It's always an output. But we have to remember we ourselves are human beings and we are worthy of compassion and self-compassion. Okay. It's almost, to me, I think it's a necessity, right? So self-compassion is a nurturing practice and it encompasses 3 key components, and those are each designed to help us treat ourselves with kindness and understanding, especially during challenging times. Okay. Let me think here. I think I might have my notes kind of mixed up. Nope, I think we're good. Okay. So let me go ahead and switch to the next slide here. Okay. So here are the 3 components of self-compassion: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Okay. So we're going to go into those each individually. And then on the next slide, the next few slides, I'm going to go through the components of self-compassion and then kind of like the flip side of that coin, like the opposite side of it. Okay. So 3 components of self-compassion: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So self-kindness is going to encourage us to treat ourselves with warmth and understanding, especially when things get hard, right? And so instead of being our own harshest critic and beating ourselves up, self-kindness allows us to be, or encourages us to be kind and warm during those moments. Common humanity. So this reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, right? Everybody faces challenges. Everyone feels inadequate sometimes. And when we realize that we're not alone in how we feel, it can kind of help us to connect with ourselves and our feelings and each other, right? And you're like, I'm not the weirdo. I mean, you might be the weirdo. I definitely am a weirdo. But in this capacity, feeling like things are hard or feeling like you're being challenged or you're depleted, right? That's normal. That's expected. That's been studied over and over and over again. So you're not a weirdo for feeling the way you feel, right? And so when we realize that, we go, oh, I'm not alone. That allows us to be more compassionate towards ourselves, right? We're not criticizing ourselves for feeling the way we feel. We go, anybody in this situation would feel this way, right? And then finally, mindfulness. So this allows us to be aware of our emotions without getting overwhelmed by them, okay? It can help us to acknowledge that we are suffering, yes, but we don't have to lose ourselves in that suffering, okay? So together, these elements help us to create a nurturing and supportive environment for our own well-being, okay? So let's get into them a little bit more deeply. So we've got self-kindness, and the other side of it is self-judgment. And I think we often fall into self-judgment when we realize we're there, right? I know there have been times where I've had to like stop and actually hear the thoughts going on in my brain. And I'm like, wow, I'm really mean to myself, right? I would never say this to anybody, but I say it to myself on a loop all day, every day, right? But sometimes we just kind of get in that pattern. We don't even realize how incredibly cruel we are to our own selves, right? So with self-kindness, it's really just about treating ourselves with the same warmth and empathy that we would offer someone that we care about, right? There's a saying that says, if you wouldn't say it to your best friend, don't say it to yourself, right? We often hold ourselves to an incredibly difficult and unrealistic standard where we allow everybody else to be human beings, right? But we don't give ourselves that kind of grace. So self-kindness is really just an invitation to embrace your imperfections, right? Embrace that emotional pain with gentleness instead of criticism, okay? So when you're feeling down, it's okay to acknowledge that you're feeling down and not judge yourself, right? Especially some of you are going through some really, really difficult things, not just physically, financially, but spiritually, emotionally, right? There could be a lot of grief in your space while you're caring for your loved one. And that could be grief of, maybe the end of your caregiving journey and what that looks like. If you're taking care of someone who has a chronic illness, or if you're taking care of children and you had an idea of what that was going to look like, your parenting and their life beyond, being a minor child, and now you have to accept a different reality. There can be grief in that, right? Of course, joy and pleasure and all those wonderful things that come alongside of life, but there could be definitely some grief there. And so we don't want to criticize ourselves or judge ourselves for feeling those feelings because they're normal. They're human feelings, and most people in your situation would feel that way, right? So we want to receive that reality with kindness and not criticism. And so when you soften that critical self-talk and accept yourself as you are, that's when you can start nurturing a more loving relationship with yourself, okay? Lots of caregiving, I would say all of caregiving is about relationship, right? Between you and that person that you're caring for. Don't forget though, you're also in relationship with yourself. And so you also need to nurture that relationship. And that's what this whole presentation is kind of an invitation for, right? Get nurturing yourself a little bit more. So the role of self-kindness. So many of us experience self-criticism, and that can lead to isolation. It can lead to shame, right? But when we embrace self-kindness, it kind of opens the door to reducing that self-judgment, and it can help to empower you to be more vulnerable and to seek support from other people. I think sometimes we don't reach out to other people because we're ashamed for the way we're feeling, or be like, oh, I shouldn't need help, or I shouldn't need support, right? We shame ourselves with these should statements all the time. But when we realize that, no, we can be empowered by admitting our vulnerability, right? And we can reach out for help. And there's no shame in needing help, especially when you're doing something incredibly difficult, right? And so when we shift, it can be very, very transformative in helping us realize that we're not alone, right? Everyone struggles. Everyone faces challenges at times. And so when you ease your self-judgment, you really create a space for growth and healing, right? And you're not beating yourself up all the time. And that's what self-judgment is, right? So that's the flip side of the coin. And it can manifest in various ways. But here's some common indicators that you are in a self-judgment loop, right? That you are judging yourself. So the first one, negative self-talk. right? Criticizing, constantly belittling yourself and your thoughts or out loud, right? Oh, I'm so stupid, or I can't do anything right, or I shouldn't have done that, right? We say this stuff to ourselves almost, instinctually sometimes, right? We might not even realize we're doing it. Next, self-judgment can show up as perfectionism. Okay, so this is when we set unrealistically high standards for ourselves, and then we get disappointed when we don't meet them, right? We say, well, I'm going to jump over a mountain. And then when you can't do it, then you beat yourself up, right? So perfectionism can be very detrimental to our self-compassion practice. Another sign, comparing ourselves to other people. I think we just do this instinctually as human beings, right? Where do I fit in this space? Where am I safe? Where's my group, right? Where's my tribe? But then when we regularly measure our worth against other people, that can lead to feeling inadequate. Okay. Everyone's life is different. Everyone's caregiving journey is different, right? Your loved one's needs are going to be different than another person's needs, and how you meet them are going to be different. So comparing ourselves really isn't accurate, right? Somebody may be doing something that, works for them, but would never work in your situation, right? It's not wrong, it's just different. So we don't need to compare ourselves in that way. Next, fear of failure, right? That can be a big one, especially if you've made mistakes in the past that had dire consequences. Maybe you mixed up medication, or your loved one fell, or whatever the case may be. It can be really hard to kind of get over that fear and get back into the swing of things. But if we have a deep-seated fear of making mistakes, we're going to avoid anything that's challenging or new experiences, right? And we can become very isolated because we're afraid of failing. And so we don't put ourselves out there, right? Overgeneralization. So this is another sign of self-judgments, where you take one negative experience or one bad mistake and you apply it broadly to your self-worth, right? When we say things like, I'm so fill in the blank, right? We're overgeneralizing because we made a mistake. And so then all of a sudden that's our entire character, right? We're just one big flaw, right? And that's not true, right? That can't be true. We are not just one thing. We're human beings and we're many things at once, right? Next, maybe you have a hard time accepting compliments, right? You're judging yourself that you have to dismiss or downplay positive feedback from other people, right? Well, yeah, you think I've got it all together, but if you really knew, you would know that I don't, right? There's always a little asterisk that you have to place on a compliment or praise, right? Because you're judging yourself so harshly, you can't see the truth of what somebody else is saying about you. Just a few more. So self-sabotage. So this is when we engage in behaviors that undermine our own success or happiness because we feel unworthy of it. And a lot of this happens behind the scenes. A lot of this happens in our subconscious, right? So we self-sabotage to kind of prove ourselves right of how bad we are, okay? Not everybody experiences that, but it is common. Excessive guilt or shame. So we hold on to past mistakes and feelings, and we define ourselves by them, right? I'm so this, I'm so that, because I made one mistake. Overthinking. Okay, so I know a lot of caregiving requires a lot of thinking, right? You're planning your life alongside somebody else's life, and you're doing for them as you're doing for yourself. And so there's a lot of constant thinking. But when I say overthinking, I'm talking about ruminating on mistakes or perceived flaws, right? Where we're just kind of in a loop of like, oh, that bad thing that I did, I kept, you just keep thinking about it over and over and over again, right? That's what I'm talking about, overthinking. So that, again, that's a sign of self-judgment. And then finally, when we avoid vulnerability, we're hesitating to share our true selves with others because we're afraid that they're going to judge us, right? And why do we think that? Because we're judging ourselves so harshly. It makes sense that everybody else would be judging us too, right? So these are just some signs that when you recognize them, that's the first step to cultivating a more compassionate and supportive relationship with yourself, right? When we notice these harmful thoughts, right? These distorted thoughts, then we can start replacing them with positive things, okay? And these things can be barriers to our self-kindness, right? It's really difficult to be compassionate towards yourself if you're always judging yourself, right? It's really difficult to be soft and accepting of your reality when you are feeling so much shame about who you are at the core of your being, right? They don't mix. It's like water and oil. Okay. So next we have common humanity, and the other side of that is isolation. Okay. So the concepts of isolation and common humanity, they are two contrasting experiences in life, right? So isolation is referring to a state where you feel disconnected from other people. Maybe you're experiencing a lot of loneliness or alienation. Maybe you're feeling kind of detached. And this happens physically, emotionally, socially, and it can lead to things like anxiety or depression. And I do understand that isolation can kind of be a side effect, I guess, of caregiving, right? Because you don't have the freedom that you had before, where you could go and do what you wanted to do when you wanted to do it, right? Because your whole life is now wrapped up in another person's care. And so when I say isolation, it's not to shame you, because things maybe have shifted for you. But it can be a space where you almost self-isolate, right? No one's going to understand. Nobody wants to hear my problems. You're shaming yourself, right? And so you can kind of talk yourself out of being more social or more emotionally attached to people, because it can be really painful. So that's isolation. And on the other hand is common humanity. And so again, this emphasizes shared experiences and connections that bind us together as people. Okay. So anytime you jump on a Zoom and you see all these other caregivers with you, anytime you join a support group and you see all these other caregivers with you, right? Anytime you do a Google search and you see, all these articles and stuff of people who are advocating for and researching caregiver burnout and things like that, you realize, hey, I'm not alone. Right? And that can make a world of difference. Okay. So common humanity acknowledges that we all face challenges, we all struggle, we all experience joy, we all experience suffering, right? And we all can experience empathy and understanding, because we're all experiencing similar things, right? And so we're not alone. And so when we recognize our common humanity, you start to feel that sense of belonging and support, right? And that contrasts that sense of isolation. There is a skill set in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And it's kind of like, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's like you're doing the opposite of what you feel like doing. So if you're depressed and you feel like being alone, the opposite is to force yourself to go and engage with another person, right? And that'll kind of get you out of that funk, right? If you feel like you don't want to shower and you haven't showered in 3 days, getting up and taking that shower is going to help, right? So this is kind of like that kind of play where if you're feeling isolated, seek that common humanity, right? Seek people who know what you're going through, right? Try to realize like we're all kind of in this together, right? And that can kind of help negate those experiences of isolation. So when we explore that balance between those two concepts, we can really get a lot of insight into the human experience, right? It highlights the importance of community, of relationships, and acknowledging that shared experience combat that feeling of isolation, right? And that promotes mental well-being, and it can ultimately foster more connections, right? And recognizing our common humanity can help alleviate that burden of isolation. I'm not saying you have to go out and make 30 new friends in 30 days. Good Lord, I could never do that. But you can reach out, right? And you can acknowledge that there are certain things that you're going to experience as a caregiver, and it's universal, right? You're not alone. So suffering is just part of our shared human experience. And when we realize that everybody makes mistakes, everybody has difficulties, that can help dissolve that feeling of isolation and also some of that shame that maybe we feel, right? And so when you embrace that sense of common humanity, that can help you connect with other people on a deeper level, right? It can affirm that we're all in it together. And it can be a really powerful realization to realize that belonging is always possible, even in your toughest moments, right? Let's see here. Yeah, that's good. All right, let's go on to the next one. So mindfulness versus over-identification. So remember a couple slides back and I was talking about how we self-judge, right? And we self-isolate and we shame ourselves, right? Mindfulness can be a really powerful tool to overcoming a lot of that, okay? And I know when I say mindfulness, you probably have, varying ideas of what that is. Some people think it's, meditating on a mountaintop in Tibet somewhere or chanting Om for 4 hours a day or what have you, right? And that can be part of some people's mindfulness practice. But mindfulness is really just being self-aware, right? Engaging in your senses as you experience things, okay? Mindfulness can be something you incorporate into your everyday life. It doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to take up a lot of time. It's really just a decision to kind of stay in a space of awareness, right? Of what's going on around you, what's going on internally, okay? And with practice, it gets easier. It becomes more instinctual, right? So let's get into it a little bit more. So mindfulness empowers you to observe your thoughts and feelings with compassion and openness. Okay, so instead of getting caught in a cycle of rumination or negative emotions, mindfulness can guide us towards balance. So we gently acknowledge how we feel. We don't allow those feelings to define us, right? Say, I am feeling angry, not I am an angry person, right? I'm feeling sad, not I am sad, right? So we acknowledge those feelings, we don't let them define us. We can create that really good space for healing and understanding, right? So it's perfectly natural to feel what we feel. Okay, we often try to suppress things that make us feel uncomfortable or quote unquote bad emotions, but they all serve a purpose, right? And it's natural to have those feelings. But we have the strength to not let those feelings overwhelm us, and it becomes easier the more you do it, okay? So mindfulness is very important for self-kindness and self-compassion because it really is the bedrock of developing that skill, okay? So we are basically nurturing non-judgmental presence, right? We can step back from emotional pain and really just embrace that experience with compassion, right? And this will deepen our connection to ourselves, yes, and in turn with other people, right? And we can really feel more unified in that space. So what do I mean when I say we step back from that emotional pain and experience it with compassion? Well, like I said before, if you are, let's say you're caring for somebody and you're going through a really hard time with them, right? Maybe it's just one of those days, right, where anything that can go wrong is going wrong and you're getting really, really frustrated, or maybe you're feeling resentful, or maybe you're just feeling apathetic, where it's like, I just don't want to do this anymore. It's hard, it's gross, whatever, right? And then you immediately start to feel bad because like, oh, I shouldn't feel that way. They can't help it. This is, nobody's having fun. It's not just me, right? You can do that. But when we step back, instead of judging ourselves, saying, I feel this way, and then immediately shaming ourselves for feeling that way, we can say, I feel this way. Anyone in my situation would feel this way. Yes, it's difficult. And just step back and give yourself a little bit of that compassion, a little bit of that grace. That can be that little buffer that you need, right? To be able to insert some of your self-compassion in there. And then you're not beating yourself up. Then you're not carrying that weight of shame around all day because you're like, yes, this is hard. And that's okay, right? Not I'm bad because I think it's hard. Does that make sense? So it's not that you're changing how you feel. You're just changing how you receive those feelings and how you acknowledge those feelings, right? We don't want to automatically blanket them with shame. We want to offer self-compassion, okay? So the flip side of mindfulness is over-identification. So in the helping fields, we can call this, what do we call it? Kind of like vicarious trauma, right? Where you are kind of taking ownership of somebody else's suffering, making it your own, okay? And as I go through this, it might make a little bit more sense. So signs of over-identification: loss of personal boundaries, okay? So you have a difficult time separating your emotions and your experiences from those of another person, right? And often feeling what they feel. Now, this is different from being like sympathetic, right? I understand that they're in pain, and I, as a human being, acknowledge that, and I feel compassion for them, right? What I'm saying is, if somebody is upset, somebody's angry, then all of a sudden you're angry. Somebody's depressed, now you're depressed, right? They determine how you feel. And this can be kind of tricky because a lot of times we feel like, well, I'm an empathetic person and I'm going to feel what other people feel, right? And that's not wrong. But it's when you over-identify with somebody else's emotions and make them your own, that's when it becomes imbalanced, right? That's where mindfulness kind of comes into play. It's like, am I feeling this as myself, or am I feeling this as an external experience of somebody else, right? You don't take ownership. You don't have to grab it and try to fix it for yourself, okay? Next, heightened emotional reactions. So experiencing intense emotions that don't belong to you, right? And that can cause you a lot of distress. That can cause you a lot of anxiety, right? And I know this happens often, and I don't want to blanket every caregiver, but oftentimes people who are caregivers, before they get that official role, somewhere in their family system, they were probably the one that was, you know, the peacekeeper or the mediator, right? Or the helper, right? It's kind of a personality trait of caregivers. And so it can be really difficult to not take ownership of other people's emotional reactions because you're kind of maybe trained from a very young age to be that person, right? To be the regulator in your family. And so it can be really hard to decipher between your feelings and somebody else's feelings if that's kind of what you've been steeped in your whole life, right? So next, difficulty in objective thinking. So this is where you struggle to maintain a neutral perspective or rational judgment in a situation that involves other people, okay? So if you are, it's kind of like, you know, it's very hard for you to be unbothered by other people's distress, right? And when I say unbothered, I'm not saying apathetic, but again, like you feel like you have to interject in a space to smooth everything over, right? You're the fixer, you're the helper, okay? Overcommitment. So this one's kind of easy to get into as a caregiver also because, you know, you have to do a lot of things. But this is where you feel excessively responsible for other people's feelings, their problems, or choices, okay? And this is going to lead to burnout, okay? Yes, you are a caregiver, but the person you're caring for is an individual as well, okay? You don't have to feel excessively responsible for somebody else's sense of well-being. Okay. Yes, you probably are responsible in some way to a degree, right? Because you're caregiving, but it's where everything they feel is now your problem, right? Or even external family members. Maybe it's not even your care recipient. Maybe it's, you know, other people in the family, other siblings, other people who always have an opinion about what you're doing, right? And then you feel the need to kind of make them feel good, even if it doesn't really work in your situation, right? So you're committing to somebody else's, you know, well-being at the cost of your own. Okay, so that's over-identification. Just a few more here. Compulsive behavior. So engaging in behaviors aimed at rescuing or fixing someone else's problems at the expense of your own well-being, like I just said. Neglecting self-care. So you put the needs of other people ahead of your own, and that leads to physical and emotional fatigue or caregiver burnout. And again, I know there's nuance to this, right? There are times where you cannot care for yourself because the immediate needs of your loved one take priority, right? And that's okay. The idea is that you don't neglect the self-care, you just maybe put a pause and then you come back around, right? And fill your cup. Okay, we don't just shove it to the side and we never come back to it. Increased sensitivity, so being easily affected by other people's emotions or situations that can make you feel incredibly overwhelmed, right? Maybe you have a hard time making decisions because you're overly influenced by other people's preferences or feelings. I've heard so many caregivers say, well, I don't want to do it this way, but my brother really thinks we should. And brother lives in 3 states over and has never had any day with mom by himself, right? But he has all the opinions, right? And so we can have a hard time making decisions because we want to make everyone happy, except ourselves, right? So recognizing these signs that can really help with establishing healthy emotional boundaries and promoting a more balanced approach to relationships, okay? And that includes the relationship with yourself, okay? So again, it's not wrong to consider other people's feelings and preferences. It becomes unsustainable when you are only considering other people's thoughts and feelings and not ever considering your own, okay? That's not how we practice self-compassion. Okay, we have to add ourselves into that equation, otherwise it's not sustainable. So now that I've told you what makes up self-compassion, why is it good for us, right? What are the benefits of self-compassion? So there's several here, and I'm going to go through them. Let me make sure I've got all my notes together. It's been a while since I've done this training, so I want to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. So when we embrace this idea of self-compassion, we are creating a sense of calm within our nervous system, okay? And that can help alleviate feelings of anxiety or stress. A lot of the stuff that I teach you all, a lot of these tools about stress management, it's really about nervous system regulation. Okay. Our nervous systems are our greatest asset and also our worst enemy at the exact same time, right? It's designed to make us aware of danger, right? It's designed for survival, but oftentimes it can get keyed up in spaces. We have these patterns that trigger our nervous system, our alarm bells saying danger, danger, danger. And when we use things like mindfulness and self-compassion, we're kind of retraining that nervous system to say, like, it's hard, but we're not going to die, right? So we don't have to panic all the time, okay? So think back to moments when maybe a friend said some really kind words to you, or maybe gave you a reassuring touch, pat of the hand, or a hug, and that made a big difference, right, during a really tough time. Self-compassion is just offering yourself that same warmth and care that a friend would, okay? So just like receiving kindness from others, self-compassion releases a lot of those good feel-good hormones that we get, right? Like oxytocin, which is essential. That hormone is essential for us to experience feelings of safety and trust and tranquility. Okay, so it's good to get a hug from someone who cares about you, but it's also good to kind of get that, quote unquote, hug from yourself, right? Your brain's going to respond in a very similar way. But on the other side of that, self-criticism can feel threatening, right? And that prompts our bodies to react with that defense of fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so when we choose compassion over judgment, we are gently soothing those overwhelming reactions, right? So instead of saying, ugh, I'm so stupid, right? We can say, ugh, everybody makes mistakes, especially when they're tired and only had 4 hours of sleep in 2 days, and the only thing I eat today was a cheese stick and a cup of coffee. Right? Of course, you're going to make mistakes. You haven't been feeding yourself properly, right? So it's just allowing your body to say, yes, this is hard, but I don't have to beat myself up for it all the time, right? Next, self-compassion nurtures our self-esteem. So it's natural to want validation from other people, right? But remember, our own kind words can be just as uplifting. In fact, you can have people around you saying the nicest things about yourself, but if you're beating yourself up in your head, you're criticizing yourself in your head, it's almost like you're knocking all of that good stuff out of the way. And then all that's left is your head, right? All that's left are the judgments in your brain, okay? So self-compassion is really, really closely tied to how we talk to ourselves, right? So positive self-talk, extending grace to ourselves for being a human being, right? We can't help being a human being. That is really, really healthy, right? It's good for our nervous system. So take a step back when you face a setback and try to see your mistakes as events that are separate from your identity, right? I made a mistake, not I am a mistake. Okay. So that perspective can help you to view yourself through a more kinder lens, right? So instead of thinking I'm a failure, just reframe it to I made a mistake. Mistakes are part of being human, and this one moment doesn't define who I am, right? We all have off days. And in fact, mistakes are necessary for growth, right? How do we know what to do right unless we've experienced what it feels like to do something wrong, right? We learn. That's how the human brain works, okay? Another benefit, it can help you embrace life fully. So when we approach our mistakes with compassion, they become less overwhelming, right? And that can free us up, free up a lot of energy to just enjoy life, right? Because we're not spending so much time in our heads beating ourselves up, right? So when we see our setbacks as opportunities for growth rather than a negative reflection of who we are as an individual, we can find a greater sense of fulfillment in the work we do, right? In the relationships we cultivate. And when we spend less time dwelling on our perceived flaws, we can open up more space for what brings us joy, right? What connects us to loved ones, right? It's really difficult to get into a fun hobby when you're spending so much time complaining in your own brain about how horrible of a person you are, right? And we need those fun things. We need those hobbies. We need that joy to be healthy, right? Next, deepening relationships. So practicing self-compassion can strengthen our relationships because we become more kind, more patient with ourselves. We become more kind and more patient with other people, right? It's kind of like a flow, right? And so benefits of self-compassion, like improved self-esteem and joy. This allows us to approach relationships with optimism and openness, right? You might find that you're feeling at ease with yourself enhances the connections you share with those around you. Have you ever been around somebody and they're just a total sourpuss and you're just really having a hard time being around them because they're so negative, right? Very critical of themselves and then also very critical of other people. Yeah, they probably could benefit from some self-compassion, right? Like, wow, maybe you should be a little nicer to yourself. You can be a little more nicer to me, right? Next, it can help alleviate that anxiety and depression that sneaks up on us, right? Um, when you realize how much self-criticism that you're constantly inundating yourself with, it can kind of break your heart a little bit, right? And it can really impact your mental health in a bad way. So being harsh on ourselves, it can trigger that threat response in our nervous system, right? So we start to feel anxious. We start to have these running thoughts of, how we're messing everything up, right? And so when we learn to show compassion towards our struggles and our mistakes, that's a really important step to keep yourself out of that um, stress response state, right? And that alleviates those symptoms of anxiety and depression. Now, of course, if you have a clinical diagnosis of depression or if you have an anxiety disorder, self-compassion can definitely be a tool that you use to manage your symptoms. But positive self-talk isn't going to cure your depression if your doctor's prescribed you something and whatnot. Make sure you're doing all the things you're supposed to do. But again, it can just be something that comes alongside your treatment, right? It would be very, very helpful. Another benefit of self-compassion, you can find courage to take more risks, right? We all know that taking risks can be very intimidating sometimes, especially if you're really carrying a heavy load of self-judgment. We can have some fear of disappointing other people or failure, and that can be kind of daunting to try new things. But when we cultivate self-compassion, we might find it easier to step into the unknown, right? Especially if you're giving yourself permission to make mistakes, then the fear of making a mistake isn't going to be as powerful, right? So acknowledging that mistakes are a natural part of life can really empower you to take leaps with greater confidence. Next, it can help foster a growth mindset. Okay, so offering yourself grace and compassion can make you feel more resilient and capable of handling setbacks, right? If you just realize, hey, setbacks are part of life, right? It's not going to define me as a person. It's not going to ruin my life, right? I mean, some setbacks might, I guess, depending on, going to the casino all the day and gambling all your mortgage money away might be a problem. But, as far as caregiving is concerned, having a rigid mindset, that can be really difficult to embrace alternate perspectives. Maybe having a fear that you're going to be wrong can negatively impact your self-worth, right? But when we practice self-compassion, we're more inclined to explore and engage with new perspectives, new views, right? We can start to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to our sense of self, right? And so when we nurture self-compassion, we're really laying down a path that leads to greater understanding, greater joy and fulfillment in our life and in our relationships, right? And so it's good for us to remember that we are deserving of kindness, especially from ourselves, okay? Because at the end of the day, you're going to be who you're with, right? And if you're not nice to yourself, if you don't like yourself, you probably know exactly where that's going to lead, right? Not anywhere good. All right, so let's get into some exercises on how we can cultivate self-compassion. We can master this art, okay? So the first one is soothing, caring self-talk. Again, I've mentioned this already, but it's worth nailing down again, right? How we talk to ourselves is foundational, I think, to how we feel about ourselves, right? So when you're in the middle of caregiving, it can be really easy to fall into patterns of that negative and critical self-talk, right? But you're not alone in feeling overwhelmed. You're not alone in making mistakes, right? These, again, are just parts of being a human being. And you should never apologize for being the species that you are, right? You have no control over it. So the first step towards kindness or self-kindness is recognizing when we're being kind of a butthead to ourselves, right? Being mindful, right, of those thoughts. What am I saying to myself? So next time you find yourself feeling stressed or have a moment of self-doubt, maybe consider speaking to yourself in the way that that you would talk to a friend, right? Somebody who's going through something. How gentle would you be? How compassionate would you be? How much grace would you offer that person? Okay. I know you've probably all been in those situations before. So just try doing that to yourself, right? So maybe to a friend, you'd say something like, well, you're doing your best. It's normal to feel this way, right? This is challenging. I'm here for you. So you could step outside for a moment and express those words out loud to yourself. Maybe put your hand on your heart and say them silently. Sometimes talking to yourself in the mirror can help, right? Externalizing can be very helpful. And this is really good for just acknowledging your feelings, right? And bringing that sense of healing in your anxious space, okay? But you have to be intentional, right? Those critical thoughts are going to be automatic. That's why mindfulness is so foundational, because you catch that critical thought and then you can say, wait a minute, anybody in my situation would feel this way. I'm not bad for feeling this way. This is normal, right? It goes a long way. Next, write a letter from a loving friend. Okay, so writing can be a really profound way to connect with our inner selves. That's why a lot of therapists, a lot of mental health professionals will say journal, right? I will always advocate for journaling, and I will always admit that I am terrible at it. Okay. I have so many beautiful empty journals. I think I just collect covers, to be honest with you. But I do write. Fantasy and things like that, and it's helpful for me. But writing out how you feel, how, maybe the way you're perceiving something, can kind of help you look and take a more objective approach to how you're feeling, right? So if you find certain feelings or perceptions make you feel inadequate, just take a moment, jot them down, and pay attention to the emotions that arise, okay? And we can often see patterns too, right? Like, oh, I'm more hard on myself when I haven't had a lot of sleep. Or, for me as a personal story, I'm a lot more critical of myself after an afternoon with my mom. Right? I'm like, gee whiz, I was a lot cooler before I hung out with you, right? So, but those moments where you feel inadequate or kind of down on yourself or critical of yourself, write it down. What emotion did you feel, right? And then the practice is to imagine a loving friend, right? Or somebody supportive, maybe even imaginary friend, maybe you further down the path that you're on, right? You can have these visions or whatever, play these out in your mind. Just imagine somebody who understands your journey. They know your history, all the nuances that make you who you are, right? And this friend cherishes every part of you, including your struggles and your triumphs. So write a heartfelt letter from that compassionate friend's perspective. So what words of comfort or encouragement would they share with you regarding your self-judgments, right? And your experiences? What hopes do they have for you in this moment, right? So once you've poured those thoughts out onto a page, maybe just set the letter aside for a little bit and you can revisit it later. You can treat it as a special message from someone who truly cares about you. Read it slowly, allow those words to sink in. Sometimes you just need to write it out and that's all you need, one and done, right? It's just a suggestion, just an invitation, right? As a way to cultivate self-compassion, is to kind of externalize those things because it's hard for you to internalize it. So putting it outside of you can maybe make it easier to integrate later. And then the last one, take a self-compassion break. So taking a minute to acknowledge your need for space is an act of kindness towards yourself. Okay. Sometimes we get so flooded and inundated and overwhelmed with the tasks at hand and the relationships that are involved in caregiving, right? that we almost feel guilty for taking a break, taking some time just to sit with yourself, okay? But that is self-compassion, okay? So if you're feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, um, maybe place your hand on your heart, take a few moments, and ease those feelings with gentle affirmations, okay? So first, you acknowledge how you're feeling, right? Say something like, I'm feeling stressed, I'm hurting, I'm tired, I'm bored, right? Whatever it is. Just recognizing that simple act can help you connect with your present state, help you become more mindful of how you feel and why you're feeling that way, right? And then next, remind yourself you're not alone, right? Find your experience in common humanity, right? It's comforting to remember that countless other people are facing similar challenges currently, in the past, and in the future, right? You are not a singularity in feeling the way you feel, okay? And so you can say to yourself, I know other people experience this too, or everyone has bad days, right? Then you offer yourself a little bit of compassion, right? You can say things like, may I be safe and strong. May I embrace my true self. May I find joy and healing. So practicing self-compassion is a vital part of caring for yourself. And as I always say, caring for you is caring for them, right? They're not separate. So don't feel guilty for taking care of yourself, because that's part of caregiving, right? It's like you don't feel guilty for putting gas in your car because you know if you don't, it's not going to get you anywhere, right? You're not taking away from somebody by investing in yourself. Okay. So self-compassion is how we take care of ourselves, and that is how we extend that kindness out to other people too, right? So you're doing very, very important work, and you deserve compassion and love in the same way that you give it, okay? And on that note, I will end with my metta meditation. I love this because it can really remind you to put yourself in the equation of compassion, right? Remember the beginning, I open with that quote that if your compassion does not include yourself, it's incomplete, okay? So metta meditation is a great way to remind us to stay in a complete compassion, okay? So metta meditation, or loving kindness meditation, is really simple, and it encourages a connection to self and others, and it can guide you toward a place of inner peace and resilience. And so sometimes people kind of bristle at the idea of meditation because, you know, they equate it to some sort of like spiritual practice, or there's like a religious component to it. And a lot of, you know, modern religions and older religions and stuff, they do incorporate meditation. But meditation in and of itself is not religious, it's secular. Okay, so it can be adapted to any belief system, any walk of life, and it doesn't have to be attached to anything other than just your nervous system. Okay. So the way metta meditation works is we begin by generating feelings of love and kindness towards ourselves first. Okay, that is the core, that is the bedrock, that is the focal point. Okay, and it's not selfish. Okay, it's essential. Okay, so we silently repeat phrases like this: May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Okay, we just kind of feel the warmth of that. We might not believe it at first. We just kind of feel that, right? And then we extend it out. So think of like ripples in a pond, okay? So think about maybe a family member or somebody that you really, really care about, right? Someone who's easy to love, right? And you do the same thing, but you put their name. So I'll use my husband's name. I'll say, may Brian be happy. May Brian be healthy. May Brian be safe. May Brian live with ease, right? Those are easy. And then we can feel that love as we hold them close in our hearts, right? And then we widen our circle. So gradually expand well wishes to include all family members, all friends, maybe even people that challenge you a little bit, right? We kind of go out, right? Maybe people that are, you know, start with ourselves, maybe people who are easy to love, maybe people who are, you know, extended family, right? Maybe somebody we feel neutral about. And then if we're feeling really brave, people who kind of get on our nerves, maybe people we just really can't stand, right? And then, you might not get there right away, right? Sometimes that's hard, and that's okay. I'll give you grace on that, right? But then at the end, we can expand it to beings everywhere, right? Our community, our country, our world. We can say things like, may all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy, right? We go through that. And the reason why we do this, even just a few minutes a day, it nurtures a deeper sense of peace and resilience because we are cultivating kindness, okay? We are inviting that into our space, okay? But it's important to be patient. This is not an overnight thing. You're not going to just rattle this off and be like, well, I love everybody, everything's fine. I'm not upset anymore. This is, I'm perfect, right? It doesn't work that way. Be patient, right? Allow yourself grace during that transition, right? Because it's going to be kind of hard. There's probably some people you think about right now. It's like, I could never wish them safety, health, and kindness, right? I can never wish that their life is easy because they don't deserve it, right? And that's okay. That's completely human, right? This is a practice, right? We get there eventually. It unfolds over time. And when we infuse these phrases into our daily life, into our daily interactions, into moments of stress, we're allowing kindness to guide us, okay? So kindness to me is not something I give other people because they're worthy of it. Kindness to me is a character trait. I will always default to kindness. And when that, if I see that you're not really a safe person, right? Then that kindness doesn't stop. It just now becomes my own kindness, right? I'm going to be kind to myself by removing you from my space, right? So kindness works both ways. So again, this meditation, it's just an invitation to help you cultivate kindness and compassion within yourself first, and then rejuvenating your spirit as you care for other people. And that enhances your emotional well-being, and that radiates out into all the other spaces that you find yourself in. So that is all my info for today. Let me stop my share and my recording.